Get your hands off me. I told you, I'm not resisting. Her voice cracked, raw and trembling, but firm enough to make the room pause for just a second. Her breath came hard and fast as the officer's rough hands pushed her harder against the cold, steel desk. The edge of the desk bit into her stomach, and she winced, but refused to cry out. The fluorescent lights above hummed sharply, making the room feel even smaller, more suffocating. Don't move. The officer barked the words so loudly that they bounced off the walls, making the others in the room flinch. You hear me? Stay right there. She twisted slightly, enough to turn her head and meet his eyes. I didn't do anything wrong. Her voice rose now, desperate, angry, but controlled. I'm not resisting. Look at me, just look at me. But he didn't look. He didn't care. Shut up. He shoved her down again, this time harder, until the cold surface of the desk flattened her palms and pressed against her chest. You people always have excuses. Always think you can talk your way out of this, don't you? Her breath hitched. You people. The words sliced through her like a blade, sharp and deliberate. You heard me, he snapped. Think you can walk in here like you own the place? Not today. The smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth sent a jolt of heat through her veins, rage, burning and bitter, but trapped beneath layers of restraint. She gritted her teeth. You don't understand, no, you don't understand. He cut her off. You're in my station. My rules. And if you can't follow them, you're gonna learn the hard way. Her heart pounded as her mind raced for something, anything, to stop what was about to happen. But before she could even form the words, he reached for the taser on his belt. No. Don't. The sharp crackle filled the air, sudden and deafening. Pain exploded through her body, every nerve igniting like fire. She hit the ground hard, the impact rattling through her bones, but the pain didn't stop. It pulsed through her limbs, leaving her paralyzed, breathless, and humiliated. The officer stepped closer, towering over her crumpled form. The taser still hummed in his hand, its sharp electric buzz fading slowly as he tilted his head and sneered. I told you to listen, he said, his voice low and sharp. But you just couldn't help yourself, could you? The room fell silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Some of the officers sitting nearby turned away, staring hard at their desks, pretending not to notice. A few exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them said a word. Not one. You saw that, the officer said, turning to address the room. Resisting arrest. Ignoring orders. This is exactly what happens when you think you're above the law. The woman on the floor fought to steady her breathing. Her muscles still twitched from the shock, her hands trembling as they struggled to find support against the desk. But as she slowly pushed herself up, her eyes locked on his. They didn't waver. They didn't break. And the man holding the taser froze for just a second. Something about her stare, the fire in it, the defiance, made him hesitate. But then it was gone, and the smirk returned. You're lucky that's all you got, he spat, stepping back. Now get out of my station before I really show you what happens when you mouth off. She didn't respond. She couldn't, not yet. Her entire body still burned, every muscle still weak. But the anger was there, simmering beneath her skin, and she knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because what no one in that room knew, what no one had even bothered to ask, was that the woman they had just humiliated, the woman lying on the floor, shaking and gasping for breath, wasn't just another civilian. She wasn't some random suspect dragged off the street. She was the new chief of police. The very woman who had been assigned to clean up that department. To investigate corruption. To weed out officers exactly like the one standing over her. And now, her investigation wasn't just professional. It was personal. But how does a woman who's been humiliated in front of an entire room of officers rise up from the floor and take back control? How does she face the man who shocked her into silence and prove that his power over her was nothing but an illusion? And what happens when he finally realizes exactly who she is, and what she's capable of? This is not just a story about revenge. It's about justice. About standing up, even when you've been knocked down. It's about the tables turning so fast that the ones who once held power are left scrambling to keep up. Stay until the end, because what happens next is something you'll never see coming. Hello, dear listener. Here at Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism, prejudice, and discrimination. We believe in equality, justice, and respect for everyone, no matter their background or skin color. This channel is a safe space where stories not only entertain but also inspire reflection and change. We hope you enjoy this powerful and emotional story. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new twist-filled tale. Now, sit back and get ready for an unforgettable journey. Enjoy the story. The sound of boots echoed through the narrow hallways of the precinct, sharp and deliberate, a reminder of authority. The walls were lined with faded posters about community safety and officer integrity, their corners curling from years of neglect. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and sweat, a combination that clung stubbornly to the room like the tension that had settled over it. Desks cluttered with paperwork and half-empty mugs filled the space, creating a chaotic yet functional environment. At the center of it all, Officer Travis Moore stood with his arms crossed, his uniform pressed so sharply it could cut. His badge gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and his eyes carried the kind of weight that came from knowing he was in control, or at least believing it. Travis wasn't just another cop. He had been with the department for over a decade, rising through the ranks not because of talent but because he knew how to play the game. He had friends in high places, men who turned a blind eye when complaints surfaced, complaints about his temper, his methods, and the way he treated suspects, especially those who didn't look like him. He walked with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences, and today was no different. Across the room, a few officers murmured to each other, their conversations hushed but not unnoticed. No one wanted to draw Travis's attention. They had seen what happened when someone did. He wasn't the kind of man who tolerated being questioned, and that was exactly why so many people feared him. But not everyone. At the front desk, a woman stood, her posture straight and her chin slightly raised. Her name was Maya Bennett, and everything about her presence demanded attention. Her dark skin seemed to glow under the unforgiving lights, and her sharp brown eyes swept the room with quiet calculation. She wore a navy blue blazer over a crisp white blouse, paired with slacks that hugged her tall, slender frame. She looked polished, professional, but there was something else about her, something unspoken yet undeniable. Maya wasn't intimidated. She had spent years fighting to get where she was, pushing through obstacles that most people never saw. Growing up in a small, predominantly white town in Georgia, she had learned early on what it felt like to be underestimated, ignored, and dismissed. It had shaped her, hardened her in ways that made her resilient but also left scars she rarely let anyone see. Her mother, a schoolteacher, had always told her to keep her head high, no matter how much the world tried to push her down. And Maya had listened. She studied hard, earned scholarships, and graduated at the top of her class in criminal justice. She joined the police force not because she believed it was perfect, but because she believed it could be better. Maya had seen firsthand what happened when people in power abused it. She had seen friends and neighbors treated like criminals before they even opened their mouths. That was why she had vowed to change things, starting from the inside. She climbed the ranks quickly, earning respect and recognition along the way. But not everyone was happy about her rise, especially men like Travis. Today, Maya had walked into this precinct with one goal, to make her presence known. She had been assigned here as part of a restructuring effort, and while she hadn't announced her title yet, she planned to make it clear that things were about to change. She didn't expect a warm welcome, but she hadn't anticipated what actually happened either. Travis spotted her the moment she stepped through the door. He didn't recognize her, and that was his first mistake. His second was assuming that her presence, her confidence, was some kind of challenge to his authority. "Can I help you?" he asked, stepping in front of her before she could reach the receptionist's desk. His tone was clipped, condescending, the kind of voice that demanded submission. Maya met his eyes, refusing to back down. "I'm here on official business." "I need access to." "I didn't ask why you're here," Travis interrupted. "I asked if you need help." There it was. The challenge. The assumption. The unspoken message that she didn't belong. "I can handle myself," Maya said, keeping her voice even. "Yeah." Travis leaned in just slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You sure about that?" The other officers started to notice. Heads turned. Whispers spread. But no one stepped in. "I don't have time for this," Maya said, pulling a badge from her purse. "Let me through." But Travis didn't even glance at it. Instead, he reached out and grabbed her wrist. "You're not walking past me until I say so," he growled. And that was when everything unraveled. Maya tried to pull back, but Travis tightened his grip. The room seemed to shrink, the murmurs fading into silence. Her pulse pounded in her ears as anger flared in her chest. "Get your hands off me," she demanded, her voice sharper now. "Or what?" Travis sneered. "You'll call for backup." She didn't get the chance to answer. The taser was already in his hand, and before she could process what was happening, a sharp crack split the air. Pain tore through her body, sudden and overwhelming, knocking her to the ground. Gasps filled the room, but no one moved to stop him. Travis stepped back, smug and satisfied, as Maya struggled to breathe. "Next time, learn some respect," he said, turning his back to her like she was nothing. But she wasn't nothing. And what neither he nor anyone else in that room knew was that Maya Bennett wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was their new boss. And before the day was over, Travis Moore would learn exactly who she was, and he would regret every single decision he made that morning. The precinct felt heavier now, as if the weight of what had happened earlier lingered in the air, pressing down on every corner of the room. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting a dull, pale glow over the walls lined with bulletin boards cluttered with faded posters and memos no one had read in months. The smell of stale coffee and disinfectant mixed with the faint odor of sweat, creating an atmosphere that was both sterile and oppressive. Every creak of a chair or shuffle of papers seemed amplified, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Maya sat in the small holding area outside the interrogation rooms, her back pressed stiffly against the hard plastic chair. Her shoulders ached, her wrists felt raw where Travis had grabbed her earlier, and her muscles still trembled faintly from the taser's electric shock. She hadn't moved much since they left her there, abandoned and ignored, as though she was an afterthought. Her breathing was steady now, but each inhale felt like it carried the weight of every stare, every judgment, every unspoken word that had lingered in that room when Travis humiliated her. She kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, her nails digging slightly into her palms, but her face betrayed nothing. She wasn't going to give them what they wanted. She wasn't going to let them see her break. She focused on the sounds around her, the faint hum of voices from down the hall, the ring of a phone that no one seemed in a hurry to answer, the distant clang of a door slamming shut. Each noise reminded her where she was, what had just happened, and what was still to come. The door creaked open, and she didn't need to look up to know it was him. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, the kind that announced someone who wanted to be noticed. Travis stepped inside, leaning casually against the doorframe as if nothing had happened. His uniform was still pristine, his badge catching the light in sharp flashes. He stood tall, arms crossed over his chest, with the same smug expression he'd worn since the moment she walked into the precinct. "So," Travis said, his voice dripping with condescension, "how's the view from down here?" Maya didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She just stared at him, her expression cold and unreadable. "Not so tough now, are you?" he continued, stepping closer. "What happened to all that attitude earlier? All that confidence?" Maya tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Is this what makes you feel powerful?" Travis smirked. "Powerful? No. Just in control. And from where I'm standing, it looks like I've got all the control." She leaned back slightly, forcing her body to relax even though every muscle screamed at her to fight. "You think this is over?" He laughed, sharp and bitter. "Oh, it's over. As far as I'm concerned, you're just another loudmouth who didn't know when to shut up. But don't worry, I've made sure you won't be a problem anymore." Maya felt the heat rise in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. "You're pathetic," she said, her voice steady but cutting. The smirk faltered, just for a second, but it was enough for Maya to see the flicker of insecurity behind his eyes. "You've got a big mouth," Travis said, stepping closer again, his voice dropping lower. "You don't know how things work around here, and that's your first mistake. Your second mistake. Thinking anyone here is going to back you up." Maya leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. "And your mistake?" Her voice was sharp now, deliberate. "Thinking I'm someone you can push around." For the first time, Travis hesitated. It was subtle, a slight shift of his weight, the briefest glance toward the door, but Maya saw it. And it was enough. Before either of them could say another word, the door swung open, and Officer Daniels stepped in. He looked younger than most of the officers, and his posture screamed uncertainty. His eyes darted between Travis and Maya before settling on the floor. "Captain wants to see you," Daniels said, his voice quieter than it should have been. Travis didn't move. "He can wait." "No," Daniels said, clearing his throat. He said now. Travis's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Don't go anywhere," he said, pointing a finger at Maya before turning and walking out. Daniels lingered for a moment, his eyes shifting nervously. "Are you okay?" Maya raised an eyebrow. "Do I look okay?" He looked down, clearly uncomfortable. "I didn't know he was going to do that." You thought what?" Maya cut him off. "That it would just blow over. That he'd make a scene and we'd all move on." Daniel swallowed hard. "You don't understand. Travis has pull. He's been here forever. People look the other way because they're afraid," Maya finished for him. "And maybe that's the problem." Daniels hesitated, then nodded. "I'm sorry." "Don't apologize," Maya said. "Do better." Daniels opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he turned and walked out, leaving Maya alone again. The minutes dragged by, each one stretching longer than the last. Maya replayed every detail of the encounter in her mind, the looks from the other officers, the silence, the way Travis had smirked like he'd already won. But he hadn't. Not yet. Outside, voices rose in the hallway. Maya couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was sharp, tense. The door burst open, and Travis stormed back in, his face flushed. "Get up," he snapped. Maya didn't move. "Why?" "Because I said so." She crossed her arms. "You think barking orders makes you important?" Travis stepped closer, his hands balling into fists. "You're going to regret this." "No," Maya said, her voice calm but firm. "You are." The room felt smaller now, the air heavier. Travis stood there, seething, but Maya didn't flinch. She held his gaze, unshaken, knowing the moment of reckoning was coming. And when it did, it wouldn't just catch Travis off guard. It would bring down everything he thought made him untouchable. The atmosphere in the precinct was suffocating. It wasn't just the dim lighting or the hum of flickering fluorescent bulbs overhead. It was the tension, thick and heavy, that seemed to coat the walls and seep into the cracks of the worn linoleum floor. The faint hum of distant phones ringing and the shuffle of papers couldn't drown out the weight of what had already happened. Maya felt it pressing down on her chest with every passing second, but she refused to let it show. Her legs felt tight, her muscles stiff as she sat in the hard plastic chair, her back perfectly straight, her hands resting calmly on her lap. But inside, her nerves were alive, buzzing with the same energy that had jolted through her body earlier. The sting of the taser had faded, but the memory of it still burned hot. She focused on her breathing, steadying it, forcing her heart to slow down even as adrenaline surged through her veins. She wasn't going to let them see it, wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of knowing what they had done had rattled her. The door creaked open, and the sound of boots thudding against the floor made her stomach tighten. She didn't need to look up to know it was Travis. The rhythm of his steps was sharp, deliberate, each one echoing with confidence and control. He was the kind of man who walked like he owned every space he entered, and today was no different. She felt him before she saw him, the heat of his presence, the weight of his arrogance pressing against her like a physical force. When he stepped in front of her, she slowly lifted her eyes, meeting his without flinching. His smirk was already in place, sharp and condescending, like he was daring her to challenge him. "Get up," he said, his voice low but sharp, like the edge of a knife. Maya didn't move. "Why?" His smirk faltered for just a second before returning, tighter this time. "Because I said so." She tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. "You really think that still works?" His jaw tensed. "I'm done playing games with you." "Games?" Maya said, her voice calm but cutting. "You think this is a game?" "You're damn right I do," Travis snapped. "And you lost." Maya leaned back slightly, her lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile. "We'll see." His eyes flashed with something sharp, anger, maybe even doubt, but he covered it quickly, straightening his shoulders and stepping closer. "You don't get it, do you?" "No," Maya said, her voice steady. "I think you're the one who doesn't get it." Travis's face reddened. "You think you're in charge here?" Maya didn't blink. "I know I am." The room seemed to shift. It was subtle, but Travis felt it. For the first time, the ground didn't feel quite as steady beneath his feet. Before he could respond, the door swung open again, and Captain Harris stepped inside. His presence filled the room instantly, his sharp eyes cutting through the tension like a blade. "What the hell is going on in here?" Harris demanded, his voice firm. Travis turned, his shoulders squaring as if he expected backup. "I was just handling the situation." "Is that what you call it?" Harris asked, stepping closer. Travis faltered but recovered quickly. She was resisting orders. Harris held up a hand. "Enough." His eyes locked on Travis, sharp and unwavering. "Step outside." Travis's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked back at Maya, then at Harris. "But, now," Harris said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Travis's fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't argue. He turned sharply and left the room, slamming the door behind him. Harris turned to Maya. "Are you okay?" Maya stood slowly, her eyes steady. "I'm fine." "Are you sure?" "I've dealt with worse." Harris studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Come with me." Maya followed him down the hall, her heels clicking against the tile floor. Every eye in the precinct was on her now, but no one said a word. The whispers had stopped, replaced by silence so thick it seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. When they reached Harris's office, he closed the door behind them. "Sit down," he said, but Maya stayed standing. Harris exhaled and leaned against his desk. "I need to know exactly what happened." "You already know what happened." "I need to hear it from you." She crossed her arms. "He attacked me. He humiliated me. And no one stopped him. Harris rubbed the bridge of his nose. This is complicated. No, Maya said sharply. It's not. He doesn't belong here. You know that's not how this works. Then it's time to change how it works. Harris met her eyes, his expression unreadable. You're not leaving this alone, are you? Would you? Before he could answer, the door burst open again, and Travis stepped inside, his face red and his voice shaking. You can't do this, he shouted. Maya turned to face him. Do what? This is my station. You can't just walk in here and take it from you. Maya interrupted. I didn't take anything. You gave it away the second you crossed that line. Travis pointed a finger at her. You're nothing. You don't belong here. Maya stepped closer, her voice steady. That's exactly why I do. Harris stood. That's enough. Travis turned to him. You're letting her do this. I'm following protocol, Harris said. You crossed the line, Travis. And now, you're going to face the consequences. Travis's eyes darted back to Maya. You think you won? Maya didn't blink. I know I did. The air in the room shifted again, heavier this time, as the weight of what was happening finally began to sink in. Travis's hands trembled, and for the first time, Maya saw the truth in his eyes, fear. This wasn't just the end of his career. It was the end of everything he had used to define himself. And Maya didn't feel sorry for him. Not even a little. Because this wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. Travis's hands trembled at his sides, his breathing shallow as he stared at Maya, his eyes darting between her and Captain Harris as though searching for some way out, some path that didn't lead to the inevitable. But there was nothing left for him to cling to. The power he had leaned on for so long, the authority, the control, the fear he had instilled in others, was slipping away, and he knew it. Still, he refused to let go without a fight. You don't get to do this to me, Travis said, his voice sharp but shaky. You think you can just walk in here and take over? You think you're better than me? Maya stepped closer, her eyes locked on his, steady and unflinching. No, Travis. I don't think I'm better than you. I know I am. He flinched, the words hitting harder than he expected, and for the first time, Maya saw the cracks forming in his carefully constructed armor. His confidence wavered, his shoulders sagging just slightly, but then his fists clenched, and the anger returned, desperate and wild. You don't belong here, Travis snapped, his voice rising. You think wearing a badge makes you one of us? It doesn't. You'll never be one of us. Maya's jaw tightened, but she didn't let the words cut as deeply as he intended. She had heard them before, in different forms, in different places, but always with the same intent, to break her down, to make her feel small, to make her question whether she deserved to stand where she stood. But not this time. I don't need to be one of you, she said, her voice calm but sharp. I'm not here to fit in. I'm here to clean up the mess you and your buddies made. And guess what, Travis? Your time is up. Travis's face twisted with rage, and for a moment, Maya thought he might lose control completely. His chest rose and fell rapidly, and the veins in his neck bulged as he struggled to keep his composure. This isn't over, he growled. Maya leaned in, her eyes locked on his. It is for you. Travis opened his mouth to fire back, but before he could speak, the door swung open, and two internal affairs officers stepped inside. Their presence shifted the energy in the room immediately, their uniforms crisp and their expressions unreadable. Travis froze, his eyes darting to Harris, then back to Maya. What the hell is this? Travis demanded, his voice cracking slightly. It's called accountability, Maya said, her voice sharp. Something you should have thought about before you put your hands on me. One of the officers stepped forward, pulling a folded document from his pocket and handing it to Travis. Officer Moore, you are hereby placed on administrative leave pending investigation into allegations of excessive force, misconduct, and abuse of power. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your badge, weapon, and any official duties until further notice. Travis's face turned pale, his hands shaking as he grabbed the paper and stared at it like it might change if he looked hard enough. You can't do this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Harris stepped forward, his tone firm. It's already done. Travis looked at him, desperation creeping into his eyes. You're just going to stand there and let this happen? I'm not letting anything happen, Travis, Harris said. You brought this on yourself. No, Travis said, shaking his head. This is her. She set me up. She's been planning this since she walked through that door. Maya stepped closer, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. You did this to yourself, Travis. The only thing I did was make sure everyone saw it. Travis turned to her, his face red and his eyes wild. You think you're better than me because you made it to the top? Because you got lucky? Maya's voice dropped, low and steady. No, Travis. I'm not better than you because I made it to the top. I'm better than you because I didn't have to step on people to get here. I didn't have to abuse my power or humiliate people to make myself feel important. That's the difference between you and me. And that's why you're the one standing here right now with nothing left, and I'm the one walking out of this room with my head held high. Travis's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked around the room, searching for someone, anyone, to back him up, but no one moved. The silence was deafening, and it hit him harder than any words ever could. The officers stepped forward again. Hand over your badge and weapon, one of them said. Travis hesitated, his hands trembling as he reached for the badge pinned to his chest. He unfastened it slowly, his fingers shaking as he set it on the desk. Then he reached for his holster, unbuckling it with a sharp click before laying the gun beside the badge. Maya watched every movement, her eyes steady, her expression unreadable. She wanted to feel satisfaction, wanted to feel relief, but all she felt was the weight of everything that had led to this moment. Travis looked at her one last time, his eyes filled with anger, regret, and fear. This isn't over, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maya stepped closer, her voice calm but sharp. Yes, it is. The officers took Travis by the arm, guiding him toward the door. He didn't resist, but his shoulders slumped as he walked, his steps heavy and slow. Maya watched him go, her heart pounding, but she didn't let it show. She wouldn't give him that. When the door closed behind him, Harris let out a breath and turned to Maya. You did what needed to be done. Maya nodded, but she didn't speak. She wasn't ready to let the moment settle just yet. She needed to keep moving, needed to stay focused. There was still so much work to do. Harris studied her for a moment before speaking again. I hope you're ready for what comes next. Maya met his eyes, her voice steady. I've been ready for this my whole life. Maya stood in the center of the room, her hands steady but her heart still racing. The echoes of Travis's footsteps had faded down the hall, but his words lingered like smoke, clinging to the air long after he was gone. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay grounded, to keep her composure intact even as the weight of everything settled around her. The room felt larger now, emptier, as if Travis's absence had left a void that no one was sure how to fill. Officers drifted past the open door, some stealing glances in her direction but quickly looking away when she caught their eyes. Others avoided the room entirely, their footsteps retreating down the hall as if they didn't want to be anywhere near the aftermath of what had just unfolded. Captain Harris leaned against his desk, his arms crossed and his eyes locked on Maya, studying her carefully. He didn't speak right away, giving her the space to gather herself, but she could feel the weight of his gaze, the unspoken questions swirling behind it. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but firm. This isn't over, he said. You know that, right? Maya met his eyes, her expression steady. I never thought it was. Harris nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. Travis has connections. You know as well as I do that he's not going to go quietly. He's going to fight this, and he's not going to fight fair. I'm not expecting him to, Maya said. I've dealt with men like him my entire life. This isn't new to me. Harris's gaze softened, but only slightly. It's not just him you need to worry about. There are others in this department who think like he does. Maybe they're quieter about it, but they're still here. And they're not happy about what just happened. Maya straightened her shoulders. Let them be unhappy. I didn't come here to make friends. Harris exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. You came here to make change. I get that. But change doesn't happen overnight. And the people who stand in the way of it? They don't just roll over. They push back. Hard. Then let them push, Maya said, her voice calm but sharp. I'm not going anywhere. Harris studied her for a moment longer before nodding. Good. Because this department needs someone like you. But you're going to need allies, and right now? I'm not sure how many you've got. Maya's eyes flickered toward the door, where Officer Daniels lingered just outside, pretending to check something on his clipboard. She could see the uncertainty in his posture, the hesitation in the way he kept glancing toward her but never quite stepping inside. She turned back to Harris. I'll find them, she said. Or I'll make them. Harris pushed off the desk, his tone softening. Just don't burn yourself out before the fight really starts. Maya gave him a small nod, but her focus had already shifted. The fight had already started, and she wasn't backing down. As Harris left the room, Daniels finally stepped inside, his eyes darting nervously around before settling on Maya. I just wanted to say, he hesitated, shifting the clipboard in his hands. What you did back there. That took guts. Maya tilted her head slightly. Guts? He nodded quickly. I mean, standing up to Travis like that. Most people around here wouldn't have dared. And you? Maya asked, her voice even. Would you have dared? Daniel swallowed hard. I don't know. He hesitated, then forced himself to meet her gaze. But maybe now I will. Maya held his eyes for a moment, letting his words sink in. Good. Because if you're going to stay in this department, you need to decide which side you're on. Daniels nodded again, his shoulders squaring just slightly. I know. She could see the doubt still lingering in his expression, but there was something else too, something that looked a lot like determination. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The sound of voices rising in the hallway drew both of their attention. Maya turned toward the door, her pulse quickening as she caught bits and pieces of the conversation, Travis's name, words like appeal and complaint, sharp tones laced with frustration and anger. Daniels shifted uneasily. You think he's coming back? Maya's jaw tightened. I think he's not done trying to hold on to whatever power he thinks he has left. Daniels nodded but didn't look convinced. What if he does? Maya turned to face him fully, her voice steady. Then we'll handle it. But even as the words left her lips, she felt the weight of what lay ahead pressing down harder. Travis wasn't going to let this go, and neither were the people who supported him, people who had been comfortable in the shadows, protected by the silence and complicity of those around them. And now that silence had been broken. Maya stepped out into the hallway, the eyes of the officers around her following her every move. Some looked away quickly, but others held her gaze, their expressions unreadable. She could feel the tension crackling in the air, but she didn't let it shake her. She walked with purpose, her heels clicking against the tile as if each step was a declaration. When she reached her office, she closed the door behind her and let out a slow breath. The room was small, barely big enough for the desk and filing cabinets that lined the walls, but it felt heavier now, filled with the weight of everything that had happened. Maya sat down and opened the file on her desk, her eyes scanning the pages of complaints and reports that had piled up under Travis's watch. Each one told a story, stories of abuse, of intimidation, of lives that had been damaged by the very people sworn to protect them. And now it was up to her to make sure those stories weren't ignored anymore. The precinct was changing. She could feel it in the way people looked at her, in the whispers that followed her down the hall. And change wasn't easy. It never was. But Maya hadn't come this far to back down now. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing as she made her decision. This wasn't just about Travis anymore. This was about every person who had been silenced, every voice that had been drowned out, and every life that had been scarred by the failures of the system. And Maya Bennett wasn't going to stop until the fight was over. Maya sat at her desk, the dim glow of the overhead light casting long shadows across the small office. The room felt colder now, the air heavier, like it had absorbed all the tension that had been building since the moment she stepped through the precinct doors. Her eyes moved slowly across the files spread out before her, each one a reminder of why she was here and what still needed to be done. Names and dates blurred together, but the stories remained clear, stories of abuse, misconduct, and silence. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly against the desk as her thoughts churned. She had won the first battle, but the war was far from over. A knock at the door broke through the stillness. Maya looked up to see Officer Daniel standing there, his posture stiff but his expression softer than it had been earlier. She gestured for him to come in, and he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the files on her desk before meeting her gaze. "I thought you might want an update on what's happening out there." Maya nodded, leaning forward slightly. "Go on." Daniel shifted nervously, his hands clasped together in front of him. "Travis is gone, but not quietly. He's already calling people, trying to rally support. A few officers were talking about it in the break room. He's saying you ambushed him, that this was some kind of setup." Maya's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice even. "And do they believe him?" Daniels hesitated before answering. "Some do. But not everyone. People saw what happened. They saw how he treated you. And some of them, they're starting to question things." Maya studied him carefully. "And what about you?" Daniel swallowed hard, his shoulders straightening. "I think he got what he deserved. I think it's about time someone stood up to him." Maya's eyes softened, just slightly. "Good. Because this isn't over. Not for him. And not for us." Daniels nodded, but there was still uncertainty in his eyes. He shifted again, clearly wrestling with something before finally speaking. "I need to ask you something." Maya gestured for him to continue. "How do you do it? How do you stay so calm after everything that's happened?" Maya leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest. "You think I'm calm?" She shook her head. "I'm not. I'm angry. I'm frustrated. But I don't let it control me. I can't. Because if I do, they win." Daniels nodded slowly, letting her words sink in before speaking again. "But doesn't it get exhausting? Always having to fight?" Maya's voice softened. "Of course it does. But giving up isn't an option. It never has been." Before Daniels could respond, the door burst open, and Harris stepped inside, his expression grim. "We've got a problem." Maya stood immediately, her heart pounding. "What is it?" Harris glanced at Daniels before focusing back on her. "Travis isn't backing down. He's already filed an appeal, and he's threatening to go to the press." Maya's stomach tightened, but her voice remained steady. "Let him." Harris shook his head. "It's not that simple. He's painting himself as the victim. Saying you targeted him because of personal bias." Maya's hands clenched into fists. "Personal bias? He attacked me. In front of witnesses." Harris nodded. And he's spinning it. Saying you provoked him. That you're out to clean house and don't care who you take down in the process. Daniels stepped forward. But that's not true. Everyone saw what happened. Harris exhaled sharply. Doesn't matter what people saw. What matters is what they're willing to admit. And right now, a lot of them are scared. Maya took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay grounded. So what's the plan? Harris hesitated before answering. We need to make sure this investigation is airtight. No loose ends. No gaps he can exploit. Maya nodded. Then we start now. Get the statements. Collect the evidence. Make sure there's no room for doubt. Harris gave her a long look before nodding. You sure you're ready for this? Maya's eyes hardened. I've been ready. Harris turned and left the room, leaving Maya and Daniel standing in the heavy silence that followed. Daniels looked at her, his expression uncertain. Do you think we can win this? Maya's voice was calm but firm. We don't have a choice. Daniels lingered for a moment longer before nodding and stepping out, leaving Maya alone with her thoughts. She sat down, her fingers tracing the edge of one of the files on her desk. She knew this wasn't just about Travis anymore. It was bigger than him, bigger than this department. It was about the culture that had allowed men like him to thrive for so long. And it was about the people who had suffered because of it. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had been silenced, ignored, or pushed aside. The hours passed slowly as Maya worked, her focus sharp as she combed through the evidence, piecing together the narrative that would dismantle Travis's lies. Statements were collected, video footage was reviewed, and gaps in the system began to come to light, gaps that Travis had exploited, but that Maya was determined to close. The precinct buzzed with activity, but underneath it all, there was an undercurrent of unease. People were watching her, waiting to see what would happen next. By the time night fell, Maya was exhausted, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The fight wasn't over yet, and she wasn't about to lose now. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes burning from hours of reading, but her mind still sharp. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Harris stepped inside, his face unreadable. It's done. The paperwork's filed. Travis is officially suspended pending investigation. Maya exhaled, but the relief was brief. And the rest of them? Harris hesitated. They're watching. Waiting to see what happens next. Maya nodded. Then we give them something to see. Harris studied her for a moment before speaking again. You've got guts, Bennett. Just make sure you don't run out of them before this is over. Maya gave him a small smile, but her eyes were already back on the files in front of her. I won't. As Harris left, Maya leaned forward, her hands resting on the desk as she stared at the evidence laid out before her. The fight wasn't over, but the tide was turning. And Maya Bennett was ready for whatever came next. Maya stood in the center of her office, the overhead light buzzing faintly as it cast shadows across the walls. Her eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on the piles of statements and reports spread across her desk. The weight of the task ahead felt heavier than ever, but she pushed it aside, forcing herself to stay focused. There was no room for hesitation now, not when the walls were closing in and the cracks in the foundation were finally starting to show. She could feel the tension building outside her door, the whispers and stolen glances that followed her through the hallways, but she didn't let it shake her. She had faced worse before. The knock at the door was sharp, cutting through the silence. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Harris stepped inside, his face tight, his shoulders squared like he was bracing for a fight. Maya didn't speak right away, waiting for him to close the door and lean back against it before finally meeting his eyes. What's the update? Harris crossed his arms, his expression grim. It's not good. Travis isn't letting this go. He's been making calls all day, pulling favors, trying to rally support. Maya's jaw tightened. And Harris exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. And it's working. There's talk about pushing back against the investigation. Officers are nervous. They're afraid of what happens if Travis takes them down with him. Maya leaned forward, her voice sharp. Then we remind them what happens if they don't stand up now. Harris shook his head. It's not that simple. Fear doesn't go away just because we tell it to. It digs in. And right now, it's spreading. Maya's eyes didn't waver. Let it. Fear's not my problem. Harris gave her a hard look. It is if it gets in the way of this investigation. Maya stepped closer, her voice low but firm. You think I don't know that? You think I don't feel it every time I step outside this office? But I didn't come here to make people comfortable, Harris. I came here to clean up this mess, and if that means making people afraid of what comes next, then so be it. Harris held her gaze for a long moment before finally nodding. Just be careful. You've stirred the pot, and you know what happens when you do that. Maya's voice was steady. The dirt rises to the top. Harris's expression softened slightly. And then it gets ugly. Maya didn't flinch. It's already ugly. The door opened again before Harris could respond, and Daniels stepped inside, his face pale, his eyes darting nervously between them. We've got a problem. Maya straightened. What is it now? Daniels swallowed hard. Travis is here. Maya's stomach tightened, but her voice didn't waver. Where? Daniels hesitated. He's in the lobby. Says he wants to talk to you. Harris stepped forward. Absolutely not. Daniels shook his head. He's not leaving. He's making a scene, pulling people in. Maya grabbed her blazer, her movements sharp and deliberate. Then let's give him an audience. The tension in the lobby hit her like a wall as soon as she stepped through the doors. Officers lined the perimeter, their eyes flicking between Maya and Travis like spectators at a fight. Travis stood in the center of it all, his shoulders squared, his arms crossed, and that same smug expression plastered across his face. But this time, there was something else beneath it, desperation. Maya stopped a few feet away, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. You wanted to talk. Talk. Travis smirked, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. You think you've won, don't you? Maya's eyes didn't waver. I don't think anything. I know. His smirk faltered. You're in over your head. You don't know how things work around here, but you'll find out soon enough. Maya stepped closer. I know exactly how things work. That's why I'm here. Travis's voice rose. You're tearing this department apart. You think you're fixing it, but all you're doing is making enemies. People don't trust you. They don't respect you. Maya didn't blink. I don't need their respect. I need their accountability. Travis's jaw clenched. And what about when this falls apart? When they turn on you? When you realize you can't win? Maya stepped even closer, her voice sharp and deliberate. Then I'll know I went down fighting for something that mattered. Travis opened his mouth, but Maya cut him off. And that's the difference between us. You fight for yourself. For your pride. For your ego. But me? I fight for every person who's walked through these doors and been silenced. For every victim whose case you buried because it didn't fit your narrative. For every officer who was too afraid to speak up because they knew men like you would crush them if they tried. That's why you're afraid, isn't it? Because you know your time is up. The room was silent, the weight of her words settling over the crowd like a blanket. Travis's face flushed, his fists clenching at his sides. You think this is over? Maya's voice was steady. It's already over. Harris stepped forward then, his voice sharp. That's enough. Travis turned to him, his voice shaking. You're making a mistake. Harris's eyes didn't waver. No. The mistake was letting you get away with this for as long as we did. Travis stared at him, his chest heaving, before finally turning back to Maya. You'll regret this. Maya's voice was calm. No, I won't. As Travis turned and walked out, the crowd slowly began to disperse, but the tension lingered. Maya exhaled, her hands still trembling slightly, but she didn't let it show. Daniels stepped closer, his voice low. That was intense. Maya nodded, her eyes still fixed on the door. It's not over. Daniels's voice softened. No, but it's a start. Maya turned to him, her voice steady. Then let's finish it. Daniels nodded, his shoulders squaring as he followed her back toward the office. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had shifted, and Maya Bennett wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The precinct was quieter now. The tension that had filled its halls just days ago seemed to have lifted, but Maya knew better. It wasn't gone. It was just waiting, hovering in the background, waiting for the next confrontation, the next ripple to shake the foundation she was working so hard to rebuild. She sat in her office, the blinds partially closed, letting thin slivers of sunlight streak across her desk. The stacks of reports and statements had thinned, but they weren't gone. The work was far from over. Her eyes moved over the last official document she had been waiting for, the formal termination of Travis Moore. The investigation had wrapped quickly, thanks to the overwhelming evidence, and the review board hadn't hesitated to make their decision. Travis was out, stripped of his badge and his authority. His appeals had been denied, and his name was now etched into the department's record as a cautionary tale. It was the outcome Maya had fought for, but she still couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't been enough, not yet. A knock at the door pulled her out of her thoughts. She looked up to see Harris standing there, his expression softer than she was used to. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes briefly scanning the room before settling on her. It's done, Harris said, his voice steady but low. He's gone. Maya nodded, setting the document aside. I know. Harris sat down across from her, leaning back slightly in the chair. And how do you feel about it? Maya exhaled, letting the question settle for a moment. Relieved. Angry. Ready for whatever comes next. Harris gave a small smile. That sounds about right. Maya leaned forward, her elbows resting on the desk. I know this isn't the end. There are still people here who supported him. People who looked the other way for too long. Harris nodded. And they're watching. Waiting to see if you're going to keep pushing or if this was a one-time thing. Maya's eyes narrowed. Then let's make sure they know this wasn't a one-time thing. Harris studied her for a moment before nodding. I figured you'd say that. Daniels knocked lightly before stepping in, his eyes brighter than the last time she'd seen him. He looked more sure of himself, more grounded. The reports are filed. Everything signed off. And, he paused, his expression shifting slightly. And what? Maya asked. Daniels hesitated. A few of the officers who were on the fence. They're starting to come around. I think they're seeing what this place can be instead of what it's been. Maya let that sink in before giving him a small nod. Good. But we're not done. Daniels straightened. I know. That's why I wanted to tell you, I'm in. All the way. Whatever you need. Maya's voice was calm but firm. Then let's get to work. The weeks that followed were busy. Officers who had once kept their distance began stepping forward, opening up about things they'd seen, things they'd been afraid to talk about before. The internal culture of silence that had protected men like Travis started to crack, and Maya pushed harder, refusing to let the momentum die. Policies were rewritten, training programs were overhauled, and new leadership began to emerge. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was progress. Travis, on the other hand, didn't fade away quietly. He showed up in the news, railing against the department and painting himself as the victim. He filed lawsuits, made speeches, and tried to rally supporters, but his influence waned quickly. The evidence against him was too strong, and his reputation was too damaged to recover. Eventually, he disappeared from the headlines, replaced by stories about reform and accountability. Maya didn't celebrate his fall. She didn't need to. Her focus was on the future, on building something better than what had been left behind. And as she stood in the newly remodeled briefing room weeks later, facing a group of officers who looked at her with something close to respect, she knew it had all been worth it. Harris stood in the back, arms crossed, a faint smile on his lips as Maya addressed the team. "This isn't the end of the work," she said, her voice strong and clear. "It's just the beginning. What we do here matters. The choices we make, the standards we set, they don't just affect us. They affect this community. The people who trust us to protect them. And we're not going to let them down." Daniels was the first to clap, followed quickly by the others, and for the first time, Maya allowed herself to feel the weight of it, the shift, the possibility, the hope. She stepped outside after the meeting, letting the cool air hit her face as she took a moment to breathe. The fight wasn't over. It might never be over. But for the first time, she felt like she wasn't fighting alone. And maybe that was enough. Stories like this aren't just about the people who stand up and fight. They're about the people who choose to stop looking away, who decide that silence isn't enough. They're about accountability, justice, and the courage it takes to push back against systems that are designed to resist change. So what would you do if you were in Maya's shoes? Would you stand up, even if it meant standing alone? Would you risk everything to fight for what's right? Or would you stay silent and hope someone else took the first step? Let us know in the comments. We want to hear your thoughts, your reactions, and your experiences. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories just like this one, stories that challenge, inspire, and leave you thinking long after they're over. Don't forget to hit that like button and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.